Good morning, sir. We now turn to the management of the Special Demonstration Squad, which I shall refer to as the SDS, between its formation at the end of July 1968 until approximately 1982. In this hearing, we shall be adducing the evidence of 8 civilian witnesses, together with evidence relating to a total of 24 early managers or administrators. 2 of the civilians and 7 of the former managers will give oral evidence. We expect, through a combination of oral and written evidence, to establish a clear understanding of how the SDS was managed internally. We will also begin the task of establishing how SDS managers worked with their superiors, which will be completed by future Module 2B investigations. There will be some evidence of the interaction between managers with the SDS and other police forces, as well as direct contact between the SDS and the security service. We will, of course, be using the evidence already adduced in phases 1 and 2 to inform our examinations of witnesses. We are guided by the Module 2A Special Demonstration Squad issues list, which is available on the inquiry's website. Some of the issues on the list are not engaged at all in the Tranche 1 era, most obviously the disbandment of the SDS. In relation to others, the evidence that will be adduced in Tranche 1 may amount to relevant background or context. For example, in relation to the issue concerning reporting on the Stephen Lawrence campaign and Dwayne Brooks, OBE, there is evidence from the Tranche 1 era that the SDS reported on the activities of Black justice campaigns and infiltrated far-left groups which, amongst other things, actively promoted racial equality. SDS reporting on such matters formed a part of a wider special branch interest in racial tension, and on the face of documents that we will be putting into evidence, interactions between far-left groups and persons of colour. Other issues are of central importance to our investigation of the management of the SDS in the Tranche 1 era. How the SDS was formed, constituted and operated, who it targeted, how and why, what the SDS was reporting, to whom and for what purpose, whether, and if so, to what extent, its activities were justified, what was known about the sexual contact between some SDS undercover officers and people they met whilst undercover, whether the risks of such relationships were appreciated, what managers' attitudes to sexual relationships between undercover officers and people they met whilst undercover were, whether anything was done to stop such relationships, management's response to the prosecution of some of its officers, and the use of deceased children's identities. I should make clear first that evidence relating to the management of the SDS is not confined to this hearing. We have already admitted much evidence relevant to the management of the SDS in earlier tranches, which will not need any formal repetition now. Further relevant evidence may be obtained as a result of our ongoing investigations of senior management above the SDS and the state of knowledge of the SDS within Her Majesty's government, all of which fall within our modules 2B and 2C. Secondly, the approach that we are taking involves the admission of a lot of evidence on paper, an approach which applies both to documents and to the content of all witness statements. Adopting this approach enables us to proceed more quickly and to question witnesses with more focus on the most important issues. Piecing together who the managers and administrators of the SDS in the Tranche 1 period were, which posts they held, and especially when they were in post, has been a complex and painstaking task. To assist those following the inquiry, we have produced a timeline together with an accompanying explanatory note. It graphically depicts our understanding of who served in the SDS, when, in what role, and at what rank. It is being published on the inquiry's website today, together with an explanatory note and signature guide. I emphasize that it is based on the inquiry legal team's interpretation of the material that we have seen to date, and is therefore very much subject both to the oral evidence that will be given in phase 3 and, of course, your interpretation of the evidence. The head of the SDS was usually a detective chief inspector. There were exceptions to this rule. Occasionally, a detective inspector would fulfill the role. We have obtained witness statements from all 3 surviving former heads of the SDS, namely Geoffrey Craft, Barry Moss, and Trevor Butler. All 3 are due to give oral evidence in this phase of our hearings. Mr. Craft has also provided the inquiry with a witness statement relating to his subsequent service as a superintendent at the end of the Tranche 1 era, when he had responsibility, amongst other things, for the SDS. The head of the SDS was usually supported by 1 or more detective inspectors. The number of detective inspectors serving in the SDS at any one time varies during the Tranche 1 era between 1 and 3. Both Geoffrey Craft and Trevor Butler served as detective inspectors in the SDS before being promoted, and so will give evidence about their service as both detective inspectors and detective chief inspectors. In addition, we have obtained witness statements from the 3 further surviving former SDS detective inspectors from the Tranche 1 era: Derek Bryce, Angus McIntosh, and Anthony Greenslade. Both Mr. Bryce and Mr. McIntosh will give oral evidence in this phase. Mr. Bryce will give his evidence over a video link. Beneath the detective inspectors in the rank structure sat sergeants. Normally, there were 1 or 2 sergeants serving in the SDS at any given time. We have obtained witness statements from Roy Creamer, David Smith, Dick Walker, Richard Scully, Paul Croydon, and Christopher Skay. Mr. Creamer and Mr. Smith will give oral evidence. Mr. Creamer's evidence will be given via a video link. At times, there were also constables who served in the SDS office in an administrative capacity. In this category, we have obtained a witness statement from William Ferner. Appended to the written version of this opening statement is a full list of the 24 managers and administrators in respect of whom evidence is being admitted in this phase, together with ranks and dates of service. 22 of them served in the SDS. The others are Wilf Knight and David Bicknell. Wilf Knight appeared on the BBC programme True Spies and recounted anecdotes about the SDS. However, on the evidence available to us, it appears that he did not, in fact, serve in the unit. David Bicknell served as a superintendent in the SDS chain of command between 1974 and 1975. He is unable to provide a witness statement to the inquiry, but he is one of the few people involved with the SDS from this era from whom a statement was taken by Operation Hearn. We will be publishing his Operation Hearn witness statement. The two civilian witnesses from whom we shall be receiving oral evidence are Lindsay German and Elizabeth Lester. Lindsay German rose to become one of the Socialist Workers' Party's senior officials during the Tranche 1 era, with a seat on the organisation's central committee. She also knew and had significant contact with the SDS undercover officer Colin, who used a cover name Colin Clark, during his infiltration of the SDS. Ms. German is a core participant who was affected by SDS undercover policing in later tranches. We will be requesting further evidence from her in due course. In this phase, we will be seeking her assistance solely in relation to events which occurred during the Tranche 1 era. Elizabeth Lester was a member of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, or WRP, and for a time one of the permanent residents at its White Meadows Education Centre in Derbyshire. She has stated that she cannot remember either of the undercover officers whom we heard in phase 2 had infiltrated the WRP, namely the officers who used the cover names Mike Scott and Peter Collins. However, we anticipate that she will still have valuable evidence to give about the WRP and White Meadows in particular. Roy Battersby was, at the material time, Elizabeth Lester's husband and also a member of the WRP. He resided at White Meadows with his then wife and has provided a witness statement to the inquiry. It will be admitted into evidence in writing and posted on the inquiry's website today. 5 more witness statements have been received by the inquiry. The core participant, who we are referring to as Madeline, has provided further evidence about Vince Harvey's treatment of her and her reaction to the publication of his real name. In particular, she has found a postcard which she states was sent to her by Vince Harvey, posing as Vince Miller, after the end of his deployment. We anticipate hearing more evidence in future tranches about SDS undercover officers sending postcards to their groups as part of their withdrawal strategies. Therefore, I'm going to take a moment to ask that the card exhibited to Madeline's further witness statement be displayed. It has the UCPI reference number, UCPI 5034819. Thank you. Could that be taken down now, please? Madeline articulates concerns about the fact that Vince Harvey went on to hold senior positions, including as a detective chief inspector in Special Branch, a superintendent in another police force, and ultimately as a director in the National Criminal Intelligence Service, work that included responsibility for investigating sexual offences against children. The inquiry will be investigating the role of former SDS undercover officers who went on to hold managerial positions relevant to undercover policing. For example, our investigation of managers in Tranche 1, Phase 3 includes Detective Chief Inspector Michael Ferguson and Detective Chief Inspector Barry Moss, both of whom had served as SDS undercover police officers earlier in the life of the unit. There is also reference in the documents to HN 68, serving as a detective inspector. In this capacity, his service straddles the boundary between tranches 1 and 2. Using the pseudonym Sean Lynch, he was one of the SDS's earliest undercover officers. Other former SDS undercover officers went on to manage within the unit at later dates. We will be particularly interested in Bob Lambert from this perspective because he was an SDS manager who is known to have had a number of sexual relationships and fathered a child whilst pretending to be Bob Robinson. We will also be interested in former SDS undercover officers who rose to very senior rank in the chain of command for the SDS. For example, Mr. Moss went on to become Commander Special Branch in the 1990s and will be asked to make a further witness statement for the purposes of assisting with Tranche 3 of the inquiry's work. We will be investigating what difference their former service as undercover police officers made to their management of the SDS. Madeline has drawn the inquiry's attention to one of HN 354's intelligence reports, which she states relates to a meeting that she thinks it extremely likely, but cannot be certain, that she attended. Her attendance is not recorded in the report, and she suspects that her name was deliberately omitted. Whether names were deliberately omitted from reports, and if so, why, is an issue that we will be considering in relation to HN 15 Mark Jenner's deployment in Tranche 3 and potentially others. Julia Pointer was a friend of Madeline's and a fellow member of the Socialist Workers' Party. She has provided the inquiry with a statement containing her recollections of Vince Harvey and the officer who used the cover name Phil Cooper, her response to the extensive reporting which names her, and her evidence about the nature of the Socialist Workers' Party. I shall not attempt to summarize all of Ms. Pointer's witness statement here, but I should note that she refutes Vince Harvey's evidence that she was keen to start a relationship with him. She also provides evidence corroborative of aspects of Madeline's account. Her evidence about Phil Cooper includes evidence of a close friendship that she had with another activist and hearsay evidence to the effect that Phil Cooper would regularly get stoned. She states that he said that he had a girlfriend, and she recalls participating in anti-nuclear and anti-racist campaigning with him. One of the exhibits to her witness statement is a photograph of Phil Cooper and herself taken during the course of their anti-nuclear work. It graphically illustrates why SDS undercover police officers were colloquially known as the Harries. Please could we have on display UCPI 5034799. Thank you. Could that be taken down now, please? Both Madeline's and Julia Pointer's statements will be summarised by junior counsel to the inquiry on Wednesday. John Rees states that he joined the Socialist Workers' Party in about 1977 and was also involved with the Anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism. Amongst other things, he was present both on the picket line during the Grunwick dispute and at the Battle of Lewisham. Joan Rudder states that she joined the Anti-Nazi League and began working for that organisation in approximately 1978. She explains her understanding of the ANL's aims and methods and provides an eyewitness account of her experiences at the Southall demonstration on the 23rd of April 1979, at which Blair Peach was fatally injured. Both of these witness statements will be published on the inquiry's website today. Diane Langford, who gave oral evidence in our Tranche 1 Phase 2 hearings, has provided the inquiry with a second witness statement. It addresses two matters. First, Ms. Langford explains why she now thinks that her friend Ethel, who recognized the SDS undercover officer who used the cover name David Robertson, lived in the same block as the SDS safe house, rather than the same block of flats as HN45's cover accommodation. Second, Ms. Langford explains that she has now obtained documents from the Metropolitan Police Service in response to a subject access request. She makes observations about and raises questions arising from these documents. We are publishing the record sheet from her registry file, together with a table exhibited to Ms. Langford's witness statement, which identifies which of the intelligence reports referred to in the record sheet have been published by the inquiry, providing their inquiry reference numbers. These show that Special Branch's interest in Ms. Langford and the intelligence filed about her went well beyond that provided by the SDS. The sequence in which the Phase 3 oral evidence will be called, other witness statements summarized, and the associated written evidence will be published, has been posted on the inquiry's website. The civilian witnesses will be called first. Thereafter, the evidence relating to the SDS managers or other back office staff will be adduced in broadly chronological order. An exception to this approach is that it is necessary to call Mr. Moss this week out of turn. In each case, we will be publishing documents relating to the individual concerned, together with their witness statement, where we have one. As we did in Tranche 1, Phases 1 and 2, we have produced an appendix to the written version of this opening statement, which summarizes, with some analysis, the evidence relating to each manager or member of the back office staff involved in this phase of the inquiry's hearing. In addition to the witness statements and documents relating to specific individuals to which I have just referred, we will also be adducing in evidence documents in 6 separate categories. First, some documents obtained from open sources. Secondly, extracts from Special Branch annual reports from the Tranche 1 era. Thirdly, various Special Branch management and security service documents. Fourthly, documents from the Home Office. Fifthly, relevant police regulations and general orders. Finally, some further reporting by SDS undercover officers and associated documents. They are being posted on the inquiry's website today. I shall be using much of my time this morning to introduce salient features of this evidence, although I will not cover everything that is in our written opening statement. The earliest of the open source documents are relevant to the investigation of undercover policing connected with the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign's 27th of October 1968 mass demonstration. They start with a note of an ad hoc meeting of the Prime Minister, Home Secretary, and 4 other cabinet ministers, which took place on the 16th of September 1968, together with some associated notes. The meeting concerned demonstrations and student unrest. The content of these documents evidences the fact that the October demonstration was of concern to the country's most senior elected politicians. A wide range of measures were discussed to try and control events. Despite believing there to be a risk of violence at the October demonstration, the Home Secretary, James Callaghan, did not wish to prevent the demonstration taking place. He is recorded as saying that, quote, amongst the large number of reasonable and essentially peaceful protesters would be a hardcore of agitators and militants who wanted violence and would seek to provoke the police into responding with violence. Nevertheless, it would be undesirable, even if it were practicable, to try to prevent the demonstration or march taking place. The Home Secretary was keen to use the courts to deter violent demonstrations, stating that, quote, the attitude of the courts was critical, and when the House reassembled, he proposed to take a further opportunity to remind magistrates of the need to impose adequate penalties on those brought before the courts on charges arising out of violent demonstrations. The Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, was evidently concerned about media coverage and seeking to influence it. He is recorded as directing the Home Secretary to speak to senior figures in television in these terms, quote, ministers had also expressed concern at the irresponsible behaviour of television teams on a number of occasions, and it would be right for the Home Secretary to talk to Lord Hill and Lord Ayleston on this matter and to invite their cooperation. Lord Hill was then the chairman of the Board of Governors of the British Broadcasting Corporation. Lord Ayleston was the chairman of the Independent Television Authority. At that time, the country enjoyed a total of 3 television channels, BBC One, BBC Two, and ITV. And so speaking to the 2 men named in the note would cover the whole of domestic television broadcasting. The Secretary of State for Education and Science, Edward Short, seems to have agreed and is recorded as having proposed a remarkable degree of control over what was broadcast. I quote from page 3 of the note of the ad hoc meeting of ministers. Quote, it might be worthwhile trying to get the television authorities on our side and to organise, for example, a confrontation between 3 leading radical students and 3 tough, intelligent, moderate students. The intellectual destruction of the radicals would have a considerable impact on intelligent student opinion. Alternatively, an interview might be arranged between a BBC interviewer and a group of radical students. Only if the interview went well need it be used. There was also discussion of using the withdrawal of student grants to assert discipline on university campuses. According to the note, the Prime Minister summed up the discussion as follows, quote, the meeting had shown general agreement that, while the problem of student unrest was essentially one for university and college authorities to deal with, they would be well advised to adopt a common policy on the question of reporting students with a view to the withdrawal of their grants. There was a strong case for reporting any student who, by boycotting examinations or preventing others from attending lectures, prevented his university performing its proper function. Every encouragement should be given to moderate bodies of students to assert themselves, as they had done, for example, in Bradford, against a small minority who wished to disrupt the university. He would give further thought to the question of an approach to the television authorities on this subject. The subsequent associated notes contain a number of relevant points. First, a Home Office note for the record, dated the 24th of September 1968, shows that the authorities believed that the organisers of the October demonstration were not in favour of acts of violence. The Ministry of Defence was nevertheless not reassured that the event would pass off peacefully and was considering the use of troops to protect MOD property. The note states that, quote, the Ministry of Defence had already made fairly large preparations and were contemplating providing soldiers within their building. They were told that any proposal should be agreed by ministers as it raised wide and sensitive issues. Another Home Office note for the record, dated September 1968, records behind-the-scenes efforts to try to steer events such that the October demonstration would take place on the 27th rather than the 26th of October and start from Trafalgar Square. The author, Mr. James, wrote, quote, I consulted Mr. James Elliott and the Deputy Commissioner of Police. Mr. Elliott told me that the security service would prefer the square to be made available to the VSC on October the 27th. Mr. Mark said that the Commissioner remained of the opinion that there was much advantage in Trafalgar Square being the rallying place for the large-scale demonstration on the 27th of October. I went to see Mr. Potts at the Ministry of Works, who is the principal responsible for applications for use of the square. He confirmed that the square remained free and that he would not approve any application for its use on the 27th of October without prior consultation with the Home Office. I reported the position fully to Chief Superintendent Cunningham, Special Branch, and to the Security Service. It was agreed that it was up to Special Branch now to take such steps as they thought appropriate to see that an application by the VSC for the use of the square on Sunday, the 27th of October, reaches the Ministry of Works at an early date. A remarkable Home Office note records that on the morning of the 17th of October 1968, the Home Secretary did meet with senior figures from the media. He was accompanied by the then Commissioner of Police of the Metropolis and Sir Philip Allen. Not only was Lord Ayleston present, together with the Chief Assistant to the Director General of the BBC, representing Lord Hill, so too were the chairman of no fewer than 8 newspaper publishing companies. The note records the gravity with which the Home Secretary regarded the October demonstration and the decisions that he was having to make about it. I quote, the Home Secretary said he had summoned the meeting because the demonstrations raised questions of policy on which he would be answerable to Parliament. The demonstration on the 27th of October was clearly going to be a serious occasion. It raised the question of whether exceptional action should be taken to restrict it, but he had decided against this. His attitude was that the demonstrators should have every freedom to demonstrate, but it was a freedom under the law. The most worrying feature was the appearance of certain splinter groups, mainly Trotskyists and anarchists, who were primarily interested in provoking violence. Mr. Callaghan went on to confirm that policing of the demonstration itself would follow traditional lines, and the Commissioner gave the media details of the demonstrators' plans and the policing arrangements that were being made. There are also numerous references to some of the inquiry's non-state core participants who were politically active during the Tranche 1 era. For example, Diane Langford, Lord Hayne, Piers Corbyn, the National Union of Mine Workers, Freedom Press, and Dave Morris. I beg your pardon, I think I've taken a wrong turn. Just let me get that right. Forgive me. It is not the role of this inquiry to examine the relationship between government and the media in 1968, interesting as these documents would be for that purpose. For our purposes, this material is relevant as evidence of the importance of the October demonstration to the government of the day, The attention it was being given at the highest levels of government and policing, and the length that both the government and the Metropolitan Police were going to in response to that forthcoming event. It was a big deal. 2 contemporary newspaper articles from the Times complete the open source evidence in this phase of the hearings. The first is dated the 24th of October 1968, 3 days before the October demonstration, which reported an appeal by core participant Mr. Tariq Ali for marchers to avoid a confrontation with the police. The second is dated the 28th of October 1968 and contains reporting very favourable to both the police and the Home Secretary in the immediate aftermath of the October demonstration. The headlines read, "Police win the day against militant few in March. 6,000 in Grosvenor Square fail against calm wall, and good sense praised by Callaghan." The latter article includes a passage which may be significant to the issue of justification in relation to the formation of the SDS and its operations relating to the October demonstration. It reads, quote, "In political terms, there is no doubt that the biggest success belongs to Mr. Callaghan. The Home Secretary had refused to be stampeded into banning the demonstration on the basis of some forecasts of violence, and his judgment proved correct. He relied here on reports reaching him from the police, and he made it quite clear in the Commons last week that he did not expect anything like the 100,000 demonstrators which had been forecast on the march. To what extent the reports reaching the Home Secretary from the police were based upon information obtained by SDS undercover operations needs to be considered and compared to what was available from other sources. But if the Times' report is accurate, then it appears that SDS undercover policing at least contributed to the Home Secretary's decision not to ban the October demonstration and to let uniformed police deal with it in the ordinary way. We are publishing a selection of pages from the autobiography of Sir Robert Mark, who was the Commissioner of Police for the Metropolis between 1972 and 1977. Perhaps of greatest relevance to the work of the inquiry is a passage at page 293 of the internal pagination, which refers to Sir Robert's time in the Manchester Special Branch and includes the following about subversive activity. Quote, "The simple truth is that fascists, communists, Trotskyists, anarchists, et al. Are committed to the overthrow of democracy and to the principle that the end justifies the means. Democracy must therefore protect itself by keeping a careful eye on them. It is not difficult because they have never represented a serious threat. Paradoxically, they are less likely to do so if the state continues to treat them, as at present, as a bad joke." These are the words of the man who was ultimately accountable within the Metropolitan Police for the SDS, and who, as other documents that we have found demonstrate, undoubtedly knew about the unit's existence and its work. He plainly believed that groups which aimed to overthrow parliamentary democracy should be monitored. However, the final 2 sentences, which I have just quoted, seem hard to square with Lord Harris's definition of subversion and the work of the SDS. Lord Harris defined subversive activities as those which threaten the safety or well-being of the state and which are intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial, or violent means. With this definition in mind, Sir Robert's words give rise to 2 questions, both relevant to the question whether the SDS's infiltration of such groups was justified. First, if these groups never represented a serious threat, why did they require monitoring? Secondly, If the best thing to do was to treat such groups as a bad joke, why infiltrate them on a long-term basis and report information about them in the way that the SDS did? The next open source document that I need to introduce today is an extract from core participant Diane Langford's dissertation entitled The Manchanda Connection. Ms. Langford gave evidence that her dissertation dated from 2007. She undertook to provide this material to the inquiry at the end of her oral evidence in phase 2, because it contains a previous account of the incident at which her work colleague Ethel recognized the officer who used a cover name David Robertson. You will recall, sir, the difference in the evidence given in phase 2 about this incident by Ms. Langford and HN 45. The key passage in the dissertation reads as follows, quote, "I'd got a job at the Daily Mirror and an Irish workmate, Ethel, came along with me to a meeting at the London School of Economics. John Gittings, Malcolm Caldwell, Manu, and Pat Jordan of the International Socialist Committee were getting an Indochina Solidarity Committee together. Ethel was interested in becoming involved. Dave was there. When Ethel saw him, she greeted him brightly. 'Oh, I know Dave,' she said. He grabbed her by the wrist and said, 'I want to talk to you outside.' They didn't come back. Next day at work, Ethel was cool and awkward with me. After a week of this, she asked me to meet her for a drink. Dave works for the special branch, she told me. He threatened that if I tell you of Manchanda, he'll cause something nasty to happen to my family in Ireland. Dave disappeared off the radar and was never seen again." We are including an extract from the authorized history of the Security Service, Defense of the Realm, by Christopher Andrew, which relates to vetting. Information gathered by SDS undercover officers appears to have contributed to the information filed by Special Branch and the Security Service and used for vetting purposes. In establishing the facts, the material extract is relevant because it dates the point in time at which the Security Service ceased to keep a record of rank and file members of the organizations which it considered to be subversive, namely 1992. By that time, the number of groups considered subversive had fallen from over 70 in the 1970s to around 45. None were considered to represent any significant threat to national security, and there had been no evidence in recent years that any subversive group had deliberately set out to obtain classified information. Finally, we are publishing a recording of the World in Action documentary entitled The State of Britain from 1980, which covered the 1980 Right to Work March, which was the subject of infiltration by the SDS. HN80, who used a cover name Colin Clark, and HN155, who used a cover name Phil Cooper, were both involved. The inquiry has obtained copies of Special Branch's annual reports for the years 1970 to 1983. We were informed by the Metropolitan Police that annual reports for 1968 and 1969 could not be found. Special Branch annual reports are lengthy, classified documents. Putting them through our restriction orders process in their entirety so that we could put them into open evidence was considered both unnecessary and impractical. Consequently, the approach that we have taken has been to process one report in full for publication, that for 1979. In relation to the others, we have put extracts through the restriction orders process. The significance of these annual reports is that they put the work of the SDS into the wider context of Special Branch's work overall, as represented by Special Branch as represented by Special Branch to the Commissioner of Police for the Metropolis. I am going to draw attention to a number of passages and features of the reports, but must first emphasize that this evidence is, of course, subject to evaluation in the light of the evidence that we have and will receive from non-state witnesses, and also that of state witnesses, other documents, and the legal framework. There is occasional express mention of the SDS in the annual reports. In the introduction to the 1970 report, the author first stated that, quote, "Two matters dominated the extremist scene in London during the year. The campaign against apartheid centered around the South African rugby and cricket teams and the activities of the IRA." The text then continues, first to trumpet the role of the SDS, or Special Operations Squad, as it was then known, in relation to the Stop the 70 tour campaign, but then acknowledges that the anti-apartheid campaign was no threat to the state and that many of the protesters were law-abiding. The material part of the text reads, "Although only one demonstration took place in the Metropolitan District at Twickenham on the 31st of January, the agitation around the cricket tour developed strongly, and a considerable effort was mounted by the branch to ascertain the plans of the militants. In this situation, the value of the Special Operations Squad was once again emphatically illustrated. Despite the success of the countryside agitation, which resulted in the cancellation of the cricket tour, the extremists, anarchists, Maoists, Trotskyists, were never able to transform the manifestations of protest they had created into anything faintly approaching a revolutionary situation, the ultimate purpose of their participation in all such militant activities. This is indicative of the isolation in which these elements find themselves, for it became obvious that a significant number of those engaged in the protests were not prepared to resort to violence, but preferred to make their point in a constitutional and legal way. The backlash of public opinion against the militancy associated with anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, which was evident in 1968 and 1969, clearly continued into 1970. A passage in the 1971 report clearly illustrates a belief that it was worth infiltrating left-wing activist groups just in case public disorder were to break out in the future. The material passage relates to a contingency which did not, in fact, eventuate, and reads, "It is, I think, in the order of things that the period of relatively quiet demonstrations must end soon. There are presently stirrings among the students who are protesting over projected government control of their college union finances, an issue which is attracting very strong support. 16,000 turned out in an orderly demonstration in London in November. This could well have the effect of giving them a taste for demonstrating on other controversial matters of wider interest. The question of the Rhodesian settlement has so far produced surprisingly little reaction among extremist groups, but it remains an issue which could well bring large numbers onto the streets once again, should the British government formally recognise the independence of the country. In such a situation, the patient undercover work at present being done by the special squad should prove of no little value to our uniformed colleagues." The 1974 report contains another explicit endorsement of the SDS, on this occasion in the context of the reference to the demonstration in Red Lion Square on the 15th of June, 1974, at which Kevin Gately died. Two parts of the quotation that I am about to read stand out. First, Special Branch's conclusions about the way in which revolutionaries were believed to be operating in the metropolis, and secondly, the value attaching to public order intelligence provided by the SDS. I quote, "The use of violence in the pursuit of political objectives was not, of course, the prerogative of the IRA, although our own extremist groups showed little inclination to resort to the bomb or the gun in 1974, the hardcore of dedicated, clever revolutionaries, which were to be found behind every public demonstration, pop festival, or squat, or sit-in, showed themselves ever ready to exploit such situations and use the police as the nearest and most visible form of authority as targets for political and sometimes physical attack. The most extreme example of such behaviour was to be seen in Red Lion Square on the 15th of June, when the combined forces of the extreme left were mounted in opposition to the National Front and inevitably against the police, who were trying to keep the two factions separated. The outcome of that demonstration, which is now a matter of history, underlined the value of special branch intelligence assessments in police preparations for demonstrations and the major special branch effort in London. Apart from the Irish problem, is now applied to this issue. In this respect, the work done by the Special Demonstration Squad, often in difficult and even hazardous circumstances, has proved invaluable in keeping uniformed colleagues informed of the plans of demonstrators. Were revolutionaries behind and exploiting every public demonstration, pop festival, or squat, or sit-in, or were special branch, even allowing for risks to national security generated by the Cold War, looking for Reds under the bed? Was SDS reporting for public order purposes in all the circumstances invaluable? There are references in the text which appear to be based upon specific reporting that we published in the course of phases 1 and 2. Some examples are set out in the written version of this opening statement. There are also numerous references to some of the inquiry's non-state corps participants who were politically active during the Tranche 1 era: Diane Langford, Lord Hayne, Piers Corbyn, Tariq Ali, Joan Ruddock, the National Union of Mine Workers, Freedom Press, and Dave Morris, for example. The format of the Special Branch annual reports includes sections on fields of activism of interest to Special Branch. For the purposes of Tranche 1, Phase 3, the contents of the sections on Trotskyists, Maoists, anarchists, Irish-related groups, anti-racists, and the far right are of greatest relevance. Trotskyist groups. The 1973 annual report contains the significant observation that, unlike Communist Party and the Maoists, Trotskyists in Britain have no association with and owe no allegiance to a foreign country. This observation seems relevant to the question whether, even in the Cold War era, Trotskyist groups in the United Kingdom really threaten the safety of the state. We have heard ample evidence of their subversive aims, but without the backing of a foreign power, were they a sufficient threat to meet the definition? The 1974 Special Branch Annual Report contains a passage relevant to that question. I quote, "Trotskyists share with orthodox communists the aim of the destruction of capitalism and the establishment of worldwide socialism. Unlike communists, who have seen a partial realization of their aim, Trotskyists have never come near holding any sway, and their failure has led to an almost obsessive indulgence in fine theoretical differences and sterile discussion. This in turn has resulted in a self-defeating and endemic fractionalism, which proved once again to be the principal characteristic of the British Trotskyist groups in 1974. The section of the 1976 Special Branch Annual Report, which deals with Trotskyism, commenced in a similar vein, but with added observations to the effect that one must look through their propaganda to their relatively modest size properly to evaluate their revolutionary potency. In contrast to these disparaging passages about the progress of Trotskyist aims, the annual reports go on to record the successful use of entryism by some Trotskyists. For example, the 1976 report contained the following passage on the use of entryism in the Labour Party by the Revolutionary Socialist League, which became militant tendency. I quote, "The principle of entryism is classically Trotskyist and consists of working under cover in an organization, political party, or industrial concern in order to influence and ultimately control its policies. The tactic was first highlighted last year when attempts were made by the clandestine Revolutionary Socialist League to oppose re-adoption of Labour's Minister of Overseas Development, Reg Prentice, as parliamentary member for the Newham North East constituency. Since then, the RSL has changed its name to the Militant Tendency, and with approximately 1,000 members and 80 branches distributed throughout the country, controls a national organisation of Labour students and maintains considerable influence over the Labour Party Young Socialists, the youth wing of the Labour Party. Despite the adverse publicity their activities attract, the militants persist in pursuing their aim. And through obtaining control of constituency Labour parties, have succeeded in threatening the positions of an estimated 12 members of Parliament. Perhaps the tendency's most controversial success during the year was in securing the appointment of Andy Bevan, one of its members, to the post of National Youth Organiser of the Labour Party. Being a clandestine organisation, the Militant Tendency, unlike many of its brothers, does not take to the streets on demonstrations in its own name, and as such cannot at present be regarded as a threat to public order. The reports also blame the Trotskyist SWP for major public order problems. In particular, the 1977 report apportions blame to the SWP for violence at what became known as the battles of Wood Green and Lewisham. It reads, "The SWP has also made much political capital out of the anti-National Front campaign, which brought about particularly violent clashes with police at Duckett's Common, N8, on the 23rd of April, and at Lewisham on the 13th of August. The main initiative for the physical attacks on the National Front has come from the SWP. Although the notion of a total ban on National Front marches is widely supported by most sections of the left, the Maoist CPEML have provided small but very violent contingents on anti-National Front marchers. The bulk of their membership, of about 100 persons, is in East London and are a continuing source of trouble to police." There are other passages which attributed violence to the SWP by Special Branch. The 1976 report refers to 43 police officers being injured and 44 demonstrators being arrested on the 19th of March, 1976, towards the end of the Right to Work March, which is also described as, quote, "the most successful Trotskyist-inspired event of 1976. The same report also states that frequent confrontations took place between IS supporters and members of the National Front, many of them occurring at the latter's weekly meeting place at Brick Lane, E1, and it was only the presence of a strong contingent of uniformed police officers on each occasion that prevented any serious violence from breaking out. Special Branch's perception of the SWP more generally is perhaps exemplified by the 1979's report coverage of Blair Peach's funeral, SDS reporting on which we heard evidence about in phase 2. I quote, "On the 13th of June, Blair Peach was buried at the East London Cemetery, Grange Road, London, E3. The funeral was preceded by a carefully stage-managed lying in state the previous night at the Dominion Cinema, Southall. There is little doubt that the great majority of mourners, particularly the SWP, regarded the funeral as a secular demonstration of solidarity and a propaganda exercise. Indeed, The Guardian was moved to comment on Tony Cliff, saying, 'Let us mourn, but let us organise and mobilise' at the time of the burial. Regardless of the outcome of the coroner's inquest on Peach, now adjourned to the 17th of July, the Peach affair will be used by the left for some time as an instrument of propaganda against police. The International Marxist Group, which later became the Socialist League in 1983, although small, is also asserted to be a source of public disorder problems. For example, the 1972 report states, I quote, "IMG members were well to the fore in the militant demonstration held under the auspices of the Anti-Internment League on the 5th of February, when attempts to breach uniformed police cordons across Downing Street resulted in 127 arrests." The 1975 report relates Lord Scarman's findings about the IMG's role during the disturbance at Red Lion Square the year before. Quote, "It had assaulted the police in an unexpected, unprovoked, and viciously violent attack." The 1979 report states that the IMG, including core participant Piers Corbyn, was expected to participate in resisting the Greater London Council's efforts to evict squatters. The 1980 report associates the IMG with entryism. Quote, "IMG now channels its efforts into 3 main areas, namely the infiltration of industry, the Labour Party, and the campaign for nuclear disarmament." So too does the 1982 report. The Socialist Labour League, which became the Workers' Revolutionary Party in 1973, is frequently referred to in the annual reports. However, it is not referred to as committing crimes, as a public order threat, or as an imminent threat to parliamentary democracy. It is recorded as concentrating on industrial issues and organising meetings which were well attended and orderly. It is also recorded as participating in democratic elections. From 1976 onwards, there are references to it seeking and later receiving funding from Libya's then ruler, Colonel Gaddafi, and adopting the Palestinian cause in return. Towards the end of the Tranche 1 era, Red Action emerges as a small, potentially violent Trotskyist group. We will hear more evidence about Red Action and its infiltration by the SDS later in the inquiry. Maoist groups feature regularly in the excerpts from the annual reports up to 1972, but with fewer references to them thereafter. They are typically described as small. Some, but not all, are described as being associated with violence or disorder. For example, in the 1970 report, the internationalists are described as a considerable public order problem, whereas the Communist Party of Britain, Marxist-Leninist, is described as, quote, "a long-range security problem rather than any immediate challenge to public order." The 1971 report described a reduced level of public order threat. Quote, "Although Maoists were active throughout the year, their proclivity to foment disorder was seen on remarkably few occasions, and their ardor was confined in the main to a series of internal feuds and schisms." The 1978 report explicitly addresses the impact of political changes in China following Mao's death in 1976 upon Maoist groups in this country. It reads, quote, "The political changes in China are perplexing pro-Chinese communist organizations. The Revolutionary Communist League of Britain is gradually absorbing the smaller Maoist groups, and the Communist Party of England, Marxist-Leninist, whose leader, Reg Birch, is the only individual in this area to exercise any real influence as a senior official of the AUEW, has transferred its allegiance to Albania." Although President Nixon's important visit to China in 1972 and the death of Mao in 1976 appear to have brought about some changes to the activities of Maoist groups in this country, they continue to exist and to be of interest to Special Branch. Some Maoist groups retain their reputation as a threat to public order. The 1978 report includes the following passage about the East London People's Front. I quote, "It was, of course, ELPF members who instigated the trouble at the picket of the National Front election meeting at Ilford on the 25th of February. It did not escalate into a larger incident because the Trotskyist elements at the picket would not support the ELPF agitators." Anarchists. Anarchists appear to have been regarded as posing little threat to political stability in this country, but as a public order threat. On the extremes of the anarchist scene were people capable of committing very serious acts of violence, notably bombings. Bomb attacks carried out by the Angry Brigade were the most prominent, but not the only such incidents. The 1970 report summarized anarchists as, I quote, "essentially so individualistic in outlook, and their philosophy is capable of so many diverse interpretations that they offer little threat to political stability in this country." By the same token, however, any type of anti-authoritarian activity, from passive resistance to extreme violence, can be reconciled with anarchism, and in consequence, its adherents continue to pose a public order problem, despite their small numbers. The same report also recorded petrol bombings by both members of the 9th of May movement and 4 other anarchist-inspired bombings believed to be the work of the Spanish 1st of May group. The annual reports refer to numerous anarchist groups, as well as connections with activism connected to squatting and the claiming of state benefits, for example, the Claimants Union. Incongruously, and perhaps indicative of attitudes within Special Branch towards women and women's rights, we note that the activities of the women's liberation movement are recorded under the heading anarchism and neo-anarchism in some reports. In 1973, under that heading, what is recorded about that movement involved entirely legitimate political expression. It reads, quote, "Most activity within the women's liberation movement is organized at group level, and the movement as a whole had shown itself unable to mobilize large numbers at short notice. The only demonstration of note occurred on the 2nd of February, when about 120 women demonstrated outside the House of Commons during a debate on the anti-discrimination bill. Some entered the public gallery where they applauded and cheered. Later, about 200 marched to Downing Street to present a petition." The 1976 report described anarchist groups in London as generally quiet and seeking a more respectable image. I quote, "Anarchist groups in London remain generally quiet during the year, due partly to their inability to bridge the gap between ideology and any kind of effective action, and partly to their noticeable attempts over the past year to present a more respectable image. Anarchist ideas have suffered in reputation from the criminal activities of groups such as the Angry Brigade and the Barr Meinhof group, and there are currently no personalities in the anarchist field of sufficient standing to persuade the present student generation that anarchist principles have any relevance to today's political problems. However, the same report also noted that anarchist Black Cross remained the most potentially dangerous of all anarchist factions, as it advocated individual acts of violence by its members. The 1979 report refers to the trial of the Mills-Bennett group of anarchists, which led to the acquittal of 4 who pleaded not guilty to conspiring to cause explosions, and the conviction and imprisonment for 9 years of a 5th who pleaded guilty. It also referred to proceedings at the Anarcho-Syndicalist Conference, which had taken place in November 1978, as well as a reference to core participant Dave Morris. The part of the text is of interest because it sharply contrasts these anarchists with those who perpetrated serious acts of violence. The direct action suggested at the conference was limited to riding on buses without paying the fare, breaking windows, and the production of stickers for distribution to anarcho-syndicalist groups. The latter suggestion received the most support. The May section of the 1979 report contains an unusually lengthy passage about an individual, core participant Dave Morris, who is described as an increasingly key individual and an archetypal anarchist. The 1979 section relates the arrest and charging of a young anarchist who had infiltrated the National Front's headquarters and was intending to cause criminal damage there. I referred earlier to the police raid on Freedom Press and Little A printers in 1982, which is the last entry of note about anarchists in the Special Branch Annual Report from the Tranche 1 era. Anti-racists. Special Branch interest in the activities of anti-racist campaigners is reflected in several ways in its annual reports. In the early years, 1970 to 1973, there are sections entitled Racialism, which cover specifically anti-racist groups. Stop the 70 Tour, Black Power, Action Committee Against Racialism, the Anti-Apartheid Movement, and Stop All Racialist Tours. Although there are some mentions of disorder in relation to some of these groups, a good deal of the content of these sections recites the group's activities. In 1971, there are references in the section to only minor disorder, and the 1973 section states that no serious disorder was expected from the Stop All Racialist Tours campaign. Clashes between the far right and groups which oppose them feature prominently in the reports, particularly from 1974 onwards. The monthly sections of the 1979 report include many subsections which concern or touch upon racial issues. A good deal of the content does not expressly concern public disorder, but recites the activities of groups or instances of racial tension. For example, there is a section on community relations in Islington. The race riots of 1981 feature prominently in the 1981 annual report. The far right. The public order section of the 1977 Special Branch Annual Report succinctly confirms other evidence before the inquiry, which might explain why the SDS in this era infiltrated far left organizations, but not the far right. Special Branch had other sources. The relevant passage reads, I quote, "The internal threat to public order has come mainly from the organizations of the extreme left, with the occasional incursion from their opponents at the opposite end of the spectrum. Both factions are under close scrutiny by the branch." Irish-related groups. Events relating to the Troubles were plainly high on Special Branch's agenda during the Tranche 1 era, because at that time, it had responsibility for Irish-related terrorism on the mainland. In addition to the terrorist organisations responsible for atrocities, the annual reports refer to many Irish-related campaign groups, most of which are familiar to us from the SDS's reporting. There is some reference to public disorder, but many demonstrations are described as passing off without disorder. There is limited reference to fundraising for terrorist purposes. A good deal of the relevant content of the annual reports concerns the internal affairs of the groups. The 1972 report contains a significant observation about groups campaigning about events in Ireland. I quote, "Our monitoring of Irish Republican extremist groups have shown a distinct bias in favour of relatively innocuous political and fundraising roles rather than a move towards violence." This conclusion accords with and may well have been based upon SDS reporting on Irish-related groups at the time. Record keeping. Awareness of the political sensitivity attaching to the keeping of records relating to public disorder is expressly acknowledged by Deputy Assistant Commissioner Bryan. He signed the 1979 report, which included the passage, quote, "A substantial increase in civil staff and the formation of a data entry team ensured significant progress in the computerization of those selected special branch records concerned with terrorism and public disorder. I am aware of its political sensitivity." An insight into the scale of special branch record keeping is afforded by statistics in the 1979 report. In that year, 5,268 dockets were opened. There were 1,179,503 entries in the nominal index and 229,314 searches made. A snapshot of the size and composition by rank of special branch is included in the 1979 report. The effective strength of special branch at that time was 386. Sergeants and constables were by far the most populous ranks. The 1979 report also provides an insight into the scale of special branches' vetting work at the time. Amongst other things, in 1979, there were 8,025 reports on information obtained by individual officers and 2,846 inquiries for Box 500, that is to say, the security service. So would now be a convenient moment to break.
Yes, indeed it would. We will break now for 15 minutes. May I first of all apologise to those in the public gallery to whom I had intended to extend a welcome at the start of our proceedings, but difficulties with my equipment prevented me from doing so. I now wish to put that right. Thank you. We'll break for 15 minutes.
I'm moving now to Special Branch Management and Security Service documents. So,
Yes.
a number of documents evidence liaison between the Metropolitan Police and the Security Service during the Tranche 1 era. They record what appears to have been a complex and fluctuating relationship. The earliest document is a memorandum which shows that on the 10th of January 1974, the then head of the SDS, HN 294, and his deputy, Detective Inspector Derek Bryce, attended the Security Services offices. There they were informed that the Security Service was forming a new F6 section, which would be responsible for, I quote, extremist politics to the left of the Communist Party, i.e. Trotskyists, Maoists, anarchists, the Alternative Society, etc. The associated minute sheet records a defensive response from senior police officers. The then Deputy Assistant Commissioner, Vic Gilbert, first wrote on the 30th of January 1974 to the Assistant Chief Constable, I shall ensure that senior officers here are even more protective of the work of the SDS to ensure that any operation by MI5 which goes wrong does not expose police officers to personal risk or potential embarrassment. In particular, I propose to limit further the opportunities MI5 may have for personal contact with supervising officers in charge of the SDS. Shortly afterwards, he passed the instruction down the chain of command to the Chief Superintendent of C Squad through Commander Operations, describing it as a prudent precaution. A police memorandum later the same year, dated the 13th of November 1974, records further measures being taken to safeguard the SDS in its dealings with the Security Service. The material part reads, in future, all copy reports from this section will bear the initials SDS at the top of the reports by the classification stamp, and the file or minute sheet to which the report is attached will carry the words, if a copy report is sent to box 500, it must be sent under cover to F6, redacted only. As at present, the decision to forward such a copy will rest with the Chief Superintendent of the squad concerned. This change to the filing system, which was made to enable dissemination of SDS intelligence within the Security Service to be controlled, has been of great significance to our investigation. The resulting files contain solely SDS reporting, which has greatly assisted us in identifying what was sent to the Security Service by the SDS. However, the reporting under this system was not attributed to individual officers. This has made attribution to individual officers difficult in many cases. We note that the decision whether to forward any given report to the Security Service rested with the Chief Superintendent of the squad within Special Branch, which had received the report from the SDS. Although it is clear that a great deal of SDS reporting was sent to the Security Service, it follows that we cannot assume that it all was. A series of 3 documents records an exchange in late 1975, early 1976, between the Security Service and Special Branch about their respective role in relation to the passing of security information about employees to certain employers. The relevant employers were described as government departments, List-X companies, and public corporations, including the Atomic Energy Authority, Bank of England, British Airports Authority, British Airways European and Overseas Divisions, Post Office Corporation, British Broadcasting Corporation, British Council, National Research Development Council, and Crown agents for overseas governments and administrations. The Security Service described its understanding of its role and the potential consequences for affected individuals as follows. Where a person with an adverse security record is found to be employed in the civil service, the security service has a duty to establish whether or not he has access to classified information, to provide his department with a summary of the information, and to offer an assessment of the risk which the continuation of any such access might entail. The transmission of security information to an employing authority can have serious consequences for the person concerned, leading in extreme cases to purge from the civil service, or in other cases to denial of access to classified information, which can have an adverse effect in careers. 3 documents evidence the institution of a system of informal twice-yearly meetings between senior special branch managers and representatives from the security service. We are publishing notes from the first and third such meetings held on the 11th of October 1976 and the 27th of September 1977. 2 of the matters referred to in the notes of the October 1976 meeting call for comment. First, there is a reference to the security service's vetting role, which I have just touched upon. It suggests a streamlining of the work being done to inform vetting. I quote, "There then followed some discussion on Box 500's need to fully identify applicants to join subversive organisations in view of their vetting responsibilities. There was general agreement that basic identification was the main need nowadays, and that the days had passed of long involved reports. Many of the reports produced by the SDS, including those sent to the security service, were reports about individuals, including identifying information and information about their membership of various left-wing groups. Second, there is a reference to special branch work relating to racial tension in Brixton and Notting Hill. I quote from the document at paragraph 7. Commander Watts then turned to the subject of the build-up of racial tension in the Brixton and Notting Hill areas. He stated that we were not sure of the potential for serious disorder, but were currently undertaking a study of the problem. A special section led by a DI and consisting of a sergeant and a DC from E Squad and a sergeant and a DC from C Squad had been set up for this purpose. The study would commence in the Brixton area, and one of its most important aspects was to discover to what extent left-wing extremists were influencing the coloured people in this area. The study referred to does not appear directly to have involved the SDS, but it is notable because it may, together with the special branch annual reports, help to put both isolated SDS reporting on race-related issues and specific deployments, for example, that a few years later of the officer who used the cover name Barry Tompkins into the East London Workers Against Racism group, into a wider context. Such reporting and deployments often concern the work of left-wing activists with people of colour. But intelligence gathering on this topic was clearly not limited to the SDS. It was being conducted more widely by special branch and discussed with the security service. A final observation on the October 1976 meeting concerns the prevalence of links between the special branch attendees and the SDS. The meeting was chaired by Commander Watts, under whose command, via Chief Superintendent Bicknell, the SDS was at the time. Commander Saunders was a former SDS manager, and Superintendent R. Wilson had also been involved with the SDS in the past. It is an illustration of what a small world special branch was at senior management level. The September 1977 document is notable for what it records about investigative journalism. Unfortunately, the document does not fully explain the thinking of those involved in a discussion about investigative journalism, but it states that, I quote, "The chairman underlined the need to explain the dangers of investigative journalism to special branch training courses. We have received evidence in earlier phases of reporting about journalists and on contact between activists and journalists. Whether it was simply the result of an unfiltered approach to reporting, or whether there is more to it, is presently unclear." 3 documents from 1977 evidence the security service and Metropolitan Police liaising to make the best use of Metropolitan Police Special Branch and Security Service resources. It was agreed at Deputy Assistant Commissioner level on the police side that Detective Chief Superintendents would meet their security service counterparts to discuss what was described as source planning. For our purposes, a memorandum from the then Chief Superintendent of C Squad, A. Dickinson, and Commander Operations recording the outcome of the former's meeting with his security service counterpart is particularly relevant. It shows an interest in filling gaps in the knowledge of membership of specific groups on the far left, and the security service requesting information about subversive activity within industry. Finally, in this category are documents which show that the security service invited special branch officers to a thank you party that was scheduled to take place on the 24th of October, 1983. They include a list of those due to attend, which is notable because of the number of attendees with links to the SDS. Commander Phelan had, upon his recent appointment, just assumed responsibility for the SDS. Commander Bicknell, Detective Chief Superintendent Pride, Wilson, Neal, Fisher, and Kraft had all been involved in the past with the SDS in some capacity, as had Detective Superintendent Greenslade, HN 200, who used the cover name Roger Harris, and HN 96, who used the cover name Michael James. Although altogether they comprised almost a third of the guest list. It is another example of what a small world special branch was. Home Office documents. The first 2 documents that we have obtained from the Home Office date from 1974 and relate to special branch activity in the industrial field. The first is a minute of a meeting between the then newly appointed Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, and 7 Labour members of Parliament, including John Prescott, which took place on the 30th of April, 1974. The MPs were evidently concerned about whether Special Branch was operating appropriately in the industrial field, and the documents are plainly of relevance to blacklisting generally. There is no specific reference to undercover policing or to the Special Demonstration Squad, but the concerns raised are wide enough to include concern about the use to which intelligence about persons active in the trade union movement, gathered by Special Branch as a whole, was being put. That is to say, wide enough to include, amongst other things, intelligence obtained by SDS officers about members of far-left organisations who were also trade unionists. The MPs pressed for an independent inquiry. Mr. Wellbeloved expressed the view that it was, quote, unacceptable to have what amounted to a political police force, and Mr. Atkinson was concerned about the use to which information gathered by Special Branch was being put. He is recorded as stating that, quote, Special Branch activity in the industrial field seems to have intensified in the last 2 years. Inquiries by the police into trade unions had been taking place. It could be seen as a part of a general attempt to smear the trade unions. People were anxious and apprehensive and asked themselves what reason could there be for the police investigating matters relating to trade unions, unless it was to enable the management to be warned of likely militancy. Basic questions were whether this was the right use for a branch of the police force and whether employers were entitled to information about employees and potential employees from special branch sources. There has been recent discussion in the AUEW of the function of the police. We have recovered an SDS intelligence report about the International Socialists, which covers a strike meeting. The meeting was chaired by an AUEW member who was suspected of being a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. In other words, collateral reporting on the AUEW. The second document is an internal minute to the Home Secretary, dated the 3rd of June 1974, which is stated to have followed a discussion with Sir Michael Hanley, the then Director General of the Security Service, that had taken place on the 13th of May 1974. The broad conclusions are recorded in these terms. 1. We ought not to be too sweeping in anything said about infiltration, because special branches are interested in threats to public order, which are not in themselves the business of the security service, as well as with subversive activity, which is. But there is certainly no infiltration of trade unions so far as the security service is concerned. And although we have not gone around checking with every chief officer, it would be very surprising if there was any infiltration for ordinary police reasons. We ought, however, to recognize that special branch officers engaged in finding out either about subversion or about threats to public order may very well be thought to be finding out about trade unions. Since the various subversive bodies make it an object of policy to infiltrate the unions, not for information, but for influence, and the police may try to infiltrate the subversive bodies, denials about their interest in the unions may be disbelieved, as I gather they were by Mr. Atkinson. 3. In view of the sensitivity of the subject, it would be as well to remind special branch officers about the particular need for more care and discretion in the industrial field. This is clearly related to the additional guidance provided by the Security Service to Chief Constables entitled Subversive Activity in Industrial Disputes, dated the 29th of May 1974, which we published in Phase 2. The minute goes on to deal with the use to which information obtained by special branch officers was put in a passage which is revealing on 3 counts. First, because it accepts that this was dangerous ground. Secondly, because it appears to refer to the Economic League without naming that organization. And thirdly, because it also accepts implicitly that information obtained by special branch about trade unionists might well be given either to other trade unionists or to employers, albeit without authority. It reads, the members expressed fears that information obtained by special branch officers about trade unions might be given either to other trade unionists or to employers. This is difficult ground. We know ourselves that some employers plead to be given warning if known agitators seek or obtain employment with them. The official response has always been refusal, sometimes with a hint that there are unofficial bodies which might help. But when a special branch officer is himself seeking help from an employer or from a union official, it is asking a good deal to expect him to insist invariably that he is engaged in a one-way traffic. Only good and experienced officers can maintain this position, and the most we can do is run the point home whenever there is a chance. Subversive activity in schools. The next 2 documents that we have obtained from the Home Office concern the gathering of information by the police for the security service in relation to subversive activities in schools. They may help to explain why we have found SDS reporting on children involved in activism. For example, the extensive reporting on school kids against the Nazis arising from HN 126, who used the cover name Paul Gray's deployment between 1977 and 1982. The first document is a circular produced by the Security Service, dated the 16th of December 1975, which is addressed to Chief Constables. It seeks information from police forces about subversive activity in schools, particularly, and I quote, 1, members of the teaching or administrative staff at a school who are using their position for subversive purposes. For example, attempting to convert pupils or making school premises available to subversive organizations. 2, older pupils, 14 or over, who are active in subversive organizations which are exploited for subversive purposes, such as the National Union of School Students, the NUSS. 3, members of governing bodies of schools or of other bodies who appear to be promoting subversion in the schools for which they are responsible. Recognizing the sensitivity of the territory, the circular goes on to state at paragraph 2, quote, "We do not ask you to make inquiries in schools on our behalf, but we would welcome any help you could give us on the basis of information which comes your way from the local papers or from members of the public, or by recourse to other sources outside schools which you can use without risk of embarrassment." The second document is a letter dated the 8th of December 1978 from the Security Service to the Home Office, which records that the circular was agreed between Sir Michael Hanley and Sir Arthur Peterson. The latter was a permanent Under-Secretary of State in the Home Office at the material time. Special branch training. The Home Office has provided the inquiry with a copy of the timetable for the initial training course for special branch officers, held between the 3rd and the 21st of September 1979. This document helps to add some detail to the oral evidence given by numerous of the early SDS officers that they received formal specialist training when they joined Special Branch. A day and a half of the course is devoted to subversion, with, amongst others, sessions devoted to the role of the Security Service, Police Security Service liaison, subversion in industry, Trotskyists, anarchists, and the alternative society, and, I quote the language used in the document, subversion in the UK coloured community. A further day covered public order, including A8 public order, the ultra-left, public order in the industrial field and voting offences, Trotskyists and public order, and right-wing extremism. I pause to note that the speaker for the session on Trotskyists and public order was Detective Inspector Les Willingale, who had served in the SDS as a sergeant and then as a detective inspector between 1975 and 1977. At the end of the first week, there was a 50-minute session entitled The Racial Scene. During the second week, a day and a half was devoted to the Irish Republican Army, covering both the official and provisional IRA and Protestant extremism. There is no reference in the syllabus either to the SDS or the use of undercover police officers. Terms of reference for Special Branch. The remaining 4 documents obtained from the Home Office are arguably the most significant. They relate to the terms of reference for Special Branch's assistance to the Security Service. You will recall, sir, that we published these terms of reference, which are dated the 8th of April 1970 in Phase 1. The documents that we are now putting into evidence show that at the end of the 1970s, senior officials within the Home Office had a number of concerns about the terms of reference. They were asking fundamental questions about the way in which Special Branch was assisting the Security Service, insofar as they encompass the work of the SDS They were questions that remained pertinent to the work of this inquiry more than 40 years later. The Home Office's concerns were such that at one point, a senior official wrote that the only thing that the Home Office could not do was nothing. However, we have yet to find any evidence that anything of substance was done during the Tranche 1 era. Our investigations are continuing as part of our Tranche 1 Module 2C investigation and will continue into Tranche 2. The documents in question start with a minute from the Home Office's F4 to Mr. Phillips, dated the 2nd of April, 1979. We understand this to be Sir Hayden Phillips, then Assistant Secretary in the Home Office. It confirms that the Security Service's June 1970 Terms of Reference for Special Branch, as supplemented by the circulars on subversive activities in industrial disputes and subversive activities in schools, remained current. It then refers to a meeting held by the then Permanent Secretary at the Home Office, Sir Robert Armstrong, on the 7th of December 1978, which had discussed the work which special branches undertook for the Security Service. At the meeting, it appears that it had been the then Chief Inspector of Constabularies who had initially raised concerns about how the relationship between the Security Service and Special Branch was working in practice. The memorandum reads, HMCIC had expressed the view on an earlier occasion that the Security Service sought more information from special branches than they really needed. And certainly, as Mr. Heaton has noted, the question of how far special branches should go on behalf of the Security Service and who decides this are begged by the 1970 Terms of Reference, which talk only about special branches collecting information about subversives and potentially subversive organizations and individuals in consultation with the Security Service. The Permanent Secretary is recorded to have rather tentatively proposed agreeing an up-to-date statement. I quote, Sir Robert Armstrong indicated that, although we should be in no hurry to reopen the question of the existing terms of reference, we should give consideration to putting forward a note to any new Home Secretary following a general election, which represented an agreement and up-to-date statement of what was feasible and acceptable to the Security Service and the police. The author of the memorandum records that there had been subsequent discussions about how to proceed and proposed a working party to produce more detailed guidance for the police. The only other document in the group of 4 documents which bears a date is a note from David Heaton to Mr. Andrew and Sir Brian Cubban, copied to Mr. Phillips. It is dated the 8th of October 1980 and attaches an internal discussion paper about special branches, also dated October 1980. The note appears to have followed a meeting between at least Mr. Andrew and Sir Brian Cubban the day before, at which the internal discussion paper had been mentioned. Sir Brian was by then the permanent Under Secretary of State at the Home Office, having succeeded Sir Robert Armstrong. The discussion paper repays careful reading, and I do not pretend to be able to do it full justice here. However, I will seek to alight upon some of its more salient features. It sought to identify current issues and, in a preliminary way, how they might be tackled. It begins by noting that the 1970s had seen, quote, a growth in the proportion of Security Service effort devoted to monitoring terrorism and subversion as opposed to counter-espionage work, which meant that special branches had in recent years become more heavily involved in those aspects of their duties which are the most politically sensitive. The paper then moves on to summarize criticisms of special branch. Generally, the criticisms are that branches are over-secretive and under-accountable, and that they interest themselves in and record the activities of people who are merely undertaking proper political or industrial activity. Specifically, criticism has centred on special branch work in monitoring subversion, an activity branches undertake largely on behalf of the security service. There has been concern about the records kept by special branches on individuals, particularly on those judged to be subversive. Specific recent incidents, which are described as having fueled criticism of special branch, are then enumerated. None directly concern the SDS, but the nature of the information gathered in these incidents is often not unlike that which we know was gathered by the SDS. One records the elision of opposition to racism with subversion. Quote, a young man who was recorded as of potential subversive interest because of some badges he was wearing when he passed through Dover, which indicated that he was opposed to racism. I also note in passing that the police had distanced themselves from the raid on the WRP's White Meadows Education Centre. Quote, the raid by the Derbyshire Police on the Workers' Revolutionary Party Training Centre on the advice of the Security Service, but much against the advice of the Metropolitan Police Special Branch. Concerns on the part of Chief Constables about their work for the Security Service are recorded. Quote, there have in the relatively recent past been indications that some Chief Constables are not entirely at ease about the work of special branches. Specifically, their anxieties seem to be about A, whether there was ministerial approval and authority for the work done by special branches on behalf of the security service. B, the nature of the work done on behalf of the security service and its potential for creating difficulties in ordinary police work and damaging relations between the police and the public. C, the weight to put on security service requests for special branch to undertake particular tasks. So too are concerns that operational officers in special branches seem uncertain about the proper extent of their role. In the context of whether information that was being recorded was really of security interest, an example is given of the practice which is stated to have grown up amongst port officers, quote, of reporting trade union office holders who left the UK on holiday or to attend a union meeting abroad. Having noted that the growth in special branches' assistance to the security service is likely to continue, the discussion paper proceeds to consider, in turn, quote, those issues on which there is at present uncertainty, and to prepare answers to those on which there is criticism. The first such issue is the special branch terms of reference, and on this topic, the paper contains two particularly important paragraphs. I quote, in the course of last year, and in response to the public and police concern mentioned earlier, F4 Division attempted a consolidation and updating of the 1970 terms of reference and subsequent letters of guidance. A copy of the resulting document was welcomed by HMCIC, and the head of MPSB, the security service, saw no case for revising the terms of reference and indeed likely disadvantages in so doing. They suggested that all that might be needed was for some arrangement whereby the attention of newly appointed chief officers would be drawn to the 1970 terms of reference and other relevant documents. The difficulty with this, and indeed with the draft revision of the terms of reference produced last year, is that the 1970 document begs a number of very important questions. Some of the more difficult aspects of the document are indicated by underlining on the copy at Annex A. It therefore seems that A, The 1970 document plus additions may not be a satisfactory starting point as a statement of special branch functions. B, before a revision of the documents can be attempted, however, certain central questions need to be answered. C, any attempt to continue with the revision of the terms of reference is going to require careful explanation to and discussion with the security service and the police. We believe that we have a copy of the underlined Annex A referred to in the discussion document, which identifies those parts of the terms of reference which the Home Office's F4 division were particularly concerned about. Could we display, please, UCPI 604459? And could we scroll down now, please? Onto the next page, please. Thank you. Could we scroll down to the bottom half of that page? Thank you. Could we go further down, please? Thank you. Could we go to the next page, please? Could we scroll further down, please? Keep going. I'm looking for the next underlining. Thank you. And could you scroll down to the bottom, please? Thank you. You scroll further down, please. And could you just scroll down to the very bottom? Thank you. Could that be taken down now, please? The second and related issue considered in the papers is the work of the special branches on behalf of the security service. F4 describes this work as the most sensitive aspect of the work of Special Branch and, quote, the work which can most easily jeopardize police public relations and also the area in which the police themselves, or some of them, seem least certain of the authority for their role. The papers go so far as to state, quote, it may be appropriate to ask how valuable is the work which special branches do on behalf of the security service, and what would be the implications of dropping or curtailing it. The paper next moves to consider the definition of subversion and contains important passages which criticize the use of the Harris definition of subversion. Of particular concern to F4 was the lack of any requirement for conduct to be unlawful before it could fall within the Harris definition. The relevant passages read, quote, this definition has been repeatedly criticised by Mr. Robin Cook, MP, and others, and contrasted with the definition of Lord Denning in his 1963 report that subversives are those who would contemplate the overthrow of the government by unlawful means. It is the absence in the present definition of a clear reference to unlawful activities which prompts most of the criticism. In the adjournment debate initiated by Mr. Cook on the 7th of November last year, Mr. Britton answered criticism that the present definition enables special branches to spy on perfectly proper political or trade union activity by saying that the definition is such that both limbs must apply before an activity can properly be regarded as subversive. In other words, there has to be an actual or potential threat to the safety or well-being of the state and an intention to undermine parliamentary democracy, which, taken together in police terms, will mean the detection of an illegal act or the prevention of a possible illegal act. In correspondence with Kevin McNamara MP, we use the phrase that special branch officers are properly concerned with information relating to terrorism, subversion, or other breaches of the law. But it may be doubted whether these attempts to impart the concept of unlawfulness into the present definition of subversion are wholly successful. I note that, whilst focusing on whether the definition of subversion should require illegality, the paper dilutes the requirements of the Harris definition as to the degree of threat required by interpreting it widely enough to include not only an actual, but also a potential threat. The paper records a difficulty that special branch officers were finding in practice in defining subversion. It states, quote, there is certainly evidence that special branch officers find difficulty in practice in defining the proper boundaries of subversion and, quoting a senior police officer, it is nowadays often difficult to establish where legitimate political activities end and subversion begins. I am sure that no special branch officer doing his job efficiently can avoid becoming involved, at least on the fringe, of legitimate politics of either wing. On this issue, the author's conclusions show that they were clearly dissatisfied with the status quo and felt it to be fundamentally flawed. They wrote, neither the present definition of subversion nor the 1970 terms of reference assist officers in resolving this dilemma, nor do they provide ministers or chief officers with a watertight basis on which to justify the work of police officers in investigating and recording the activities of subversives. The concerns about the difficulties with the definition of subversion are carried over into a discussion about record keeping, particularly in the context of the advent of computerized records. The authors wrote, quote, it seems reasonable to assume that in the area of subversion, the difficulty which arises in defining the proper extent of special branch interest also arises in deciding what information should be recorded, and concluded, The nature of information stored by special branches is in many respects secondary to the question what special branches are there to do. The more clearly the proper extent of their interest in subversion is defined, for example, the more easy it should be for officers to judge what they should record and what not. But there may also be a case for taking more positive steps, perhaps through HM Inspectorate, to ensure that forces procedures for judging what to record and for weeding out or disposing of irrelevant information are satisfactory. These are important observations and concerns in the context of our investigation. The intelligence reports from the Tranche 1 era that we have recovered were not computerized, but even so, we have retrieved SDS intelligence reports from both Metropolitan Police and Security Service records in large volumes that date back 40 or 50 years or more. They contain a great deal of information about the private lives of a large number of people. The questions that you must ask, sir, are not so very different from those being asked in the Home Office in 1980. Should all of this information have been recorded? Should it have been kept for so long? The authors considered the accountability of special branches, about which they also had concerns. They observed that much of special branches' work is carried out on behalf of the Security Service, which meant that the Security Service had an important say in what work special branches actually did. However, they further observed that, quote, the Security Service does not, of course, have responsibility for the way in which that work is discharged. As for police authorities and the Home Office, they wrote, quote, neither police authorities nor the Home Office have responsibility for special branch operations any more than they have for the operational aspects of other police work. Chief officers are, generally speaking, and for understandable reasons, reluctant to disclose to police authorities anything other than the most general information about their branches. The Home Secretary's national powers and responsibilities, including his special position in relation to the Security Service and the Metropolitan Police, mean, however, that the Home Office has more of an opportunity for influence. In recent years, a close working relationship has developed between the Home Office, the Security Service, and MPSB, particularly on terrorist matters and under pressure of events. This relationship is gradually being extended into other areas. But there are limits to which this is particularly so, of course, in relation to provincial special branches. The role of the Home Office in this area is often limited to picking up the pieces after some unfortunate incident. In their concluding section, the authors return to their unease about the definition of subversion, writing that, quote, there are a number of respects, most notably that in relation to the monitoring of subversion, in which it is difficult to ensure that very generalized definitions are easily turned into readily defended operations and procedures, and calling for, quote, a more coherent and coordinated approach on the basis that we, the Security Service, and the police have a clear and common view of what special branches are for and what they are doing. They then turned to some of the difficulties which they foresaw in trying to establish such an approach. Quote, the difficulties in the way of developing this sort of approach are obvious. There is the inherent sensitivity of the work special branch do. There is the operational independence of chief officers, and equally important in this case, of the Security Service. There are the operational jealousies of the police and the service. There is the need for us to define more clearly our own role and to recognize the limitations, for example, because of lack of information, and the need to distance a Home Secretary from the details of operations, which must inevitably be placed upon it. The paper concludes by proposing 5 possible ways in which to take matters forward. Of particular importance for our purposes are the first 2, which read: 1. We might seek a further discussion with the Security Service on the question of the work done by special branches on behalf of the Security Service. Sir Robert Armstrong chaired such a discussion in December 1978, but matters have moved on since then, and a meeting now might deal in particular with the questions of the revision of the terms of reference and of the definition of subversion. It is for consideration at what point HMCIC and the head of MPSB should be brought in. 2, we might try to define more clearly the justification for and proper limits of special branch and security service interest in some of the more sensitive issues. A good current example is race. We also have Annex B to the discussion paper, which is F4's draft consolidation and updating of the 1970 terms of reference for special branch. Of particular note are the proposed revision to the definition of subversion and proposed guidance on the collection and dissemination of intelligence about the subversive background to public disorder. The proposed revision to the terms of reference read, quote, subversive activities are defined as those which threaten the safety or well-being of the state and which are intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial, or violent means. This includes the activities of organizations or individuals which, while operating at present within the law, have as their long-term aim the overthrow of parliamentary democracy. The proposal is striking. It would have included activity which was both lawful and posed no current threat to the continuation of parliamentary democracy. For example, a group such as the Workers' Revolutionary Party, on the evidence that we have received about it, would appear to fall within the proposed definition, whereas it does not appear to fall within the Harris definition. Turning to the guidance on the subversive background to demonstrations, paragraph 7 of the draft revised terms of reference stated, quote, in consultation with the Security Service to investigate any subversive background to demonstrations and breaches of public order. The function at 1 above, which is the provision of intelligence affecting public order, will provide the opportunity for the collection of information about subversive elements, whether individuals or organizations, in a particular demonstration. Investigations should go no further than is necessary to fulfill the function and should be conducted with sensitivity in order to avoid any suggestion that the special branch is investigating legitimate expression of views. For consideration is whether the above wording, if it had been adopted in the terms of reference, might have brought about a change in the approach to intelligence gathering, which we have heard former SDS officers give evidence about, an approach which seems to have involved applying little, if any, filter to what was reported and or recorded. Before I move to the significant covering note which accompanied the internal discussion paper, I pause to deal with an important but undated note from David Heaton to Mr. Andrew and Mr. Wright. It seeks Sir Brian Cubbon's views about the continuation of the examination of the terms of reference for special branches. Although it is hard to be sure, this document appears to predate the discussion paper. Of particular significance is the section of note which deals with the terms of reference. It is apparent that it was thought that consolidated and updated terms of reference for special branch were needed, particularly in order to ensure that there was ministerial approval and authority for the work done by special branches on behalf of the Security Service. However, the draft consolidation had not satisfied David Heaton. It is not absolutely clear whether he is referring to the draft terms of reference which I have just spoken to, or some earlier version. but Mr. Heaton wrote, "This consolidation has now been done, but it has proved to be more of a shoring up than a pulling together, and the result is a poor thing. It is clear that no consolidation based on the 1970 terms of reference can be satisfactory. This is because those terms of reference begged a number of important questions which would have to be examined if consolidated terms of reference were to be issued. Whether under imprimatur of ACPO, ACPO, or the Home Office, these questions are: A, how can the work of police officers, which all members of Special Branch are, in investigating subversion, as currently defined, be justified, given that the definition covers some activities which are not, as such, unlawful? The current working definition of subversion is activities threatening the safety or well-being of the state and intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial, or violent means. B, how valuable is the work which special branches do on behalf of the security service, and what would be the implications of dropping or curtailing it? C, should special branches be involved at all in such areas as carrying out inquiries relating to immigration control? D, who should have effective control over individual special branches and decide on the extent of their activities? The chief officer of the force concerned or the security service? These are all questions of major importance which need careful examination before answers can even be sketched out. Time and effort would be needed for such an examination. We now therefore need to decide whether to proceed further or whether to let the current terms of reference and security service circulars stand as they are. The arguments for continuing the examination further are first the simple one that times have changed since the present terms of reference were issued, and it seems only prudent to look at them again to see if they are still sensible. Second, there is no point in special branches doing sensitive work likely to attract public criticism if examination would show that such work was not really necessary or not necessary to such an extent. Third, new terms of reference issued after such an examination would, it is to be hoped, dispel most of the anxieties felt by special branch and chief officers about accountability and control, and reassure them about ministerial approval and support for their work. Against these arguments stand the security service, who have pointed out that the original proposal to consolidate the 1970 terms of reference was made at a time of ministerial questioning of the role of special branches, and that part of its purpose was seen as reassurance to ministers vulnerable to critics of special branches. There is also a Pandora's box argument, i.e., that if we once undertake a radical examination of the basis of special branches' work, we may well destroy the confidence built up between chief officers, special branches, and the security service, not to speak of the relationship which the Home Office has with each of them. Finally, there is a question of resources. At present, F4 has not the capacity to undertake such a major exercise. Either more staff, query a principal, would be needed, admittedly only for a limited period, or some current work in F4 would have to be diverted elsewhere. Returning now to the covering note which accompanied the October 1980 discussion paper, Mr. Heaton, in his document, expresses the view that the Home Office could not do nothing. Quote, I attach a copy of the paper. It is an admirable and comprehensive analysis. The question is, where do we go from here? There are obvious constraints, not least the sensitivities of the security service, the operational independence of chief officers, and the limited resources which, given F4's other heavy commitments, we can afford to devote to this area. But the issues are too important to allow us to do nothing. The first two proposals, particularly the question of the terms of reference and of the definition of subversion, are important, but also more abstract and difficult. You may like to have the issues in mind when you visit the Security Service with the Secretary of State on the 22nd of October, and thereafter to have a meeting with Mr. Andrew, Mr. Phillips, and myself to consider how best to proceed. We are continuing our investigation of the issues raised in these important documents, and will need to consider them further once our investigation is complete. In particular, they will need to be analysed in the context of the totality of the Module 2B and 2C evidence and the legal framework. Police regulations and general orders. The police disciplinary regime during the Tranche 1 era was provided in the Police Discipline Amendment Regulations 1967, a copy of which we are publishing today. I apologise for the poor copy quality. Of particular note is Regulation 1, Discreditable Conduct, which appears wide enough to cover inappropriate sexual activity by undercover police officers. It reads, discreditable conduct, which offence is committed where a member of a police force acts in a disorderly manner or any manner prejudicial to discipline or reasonably likely to bring discredit on the reputation of the force or the police service. Regulation 15 is relevant to situations where undercover police officers committed criminal offences, at least where the offence is committed without proper authority. It provides criminal conduct, which offence is committed where a member of a police force has been found guilty by a court of law of a criminal offence. We have obtained and are posting on the website the public and other events section of both the 1969 and 1982 editions of the Metropolitan Police General Orders and Regulations. I do not propose to summarise all of the relevant provisions now, but make 4 specific observations. First, the general orders make clear the role of the section of the Metropolitan Police known as A8 in relation to public meetings involving groups at the far ends of the political spectrum. Paragraph 59 of both the 1969 and 1982 general orders reads, quote, early notification of all important meetings of communists, fascists, or other similar political organizations is to be sent by telephone in urgent cases to Special Branch and A8, giving the time and place, and if possible, the names of the principal speakers. Secondly, the 1969 and 1982 orders deal at paragraph 67, subsection 2, with police powers to enter private premises, stating that it must be remembered, however, that police have a common law right of entry in certain circumstances. For example, fear of a breach of the peace or anticipation of seditious speeches. Thirdly, the 1969 and 1982 orders both deal at paragraph 68 with the attendance of plain-clothes police officers at meetings, requiring that officers in plain clothes on duty at meetings should obtain copies of all handbills and pamphlets distributed or sold, which will be submitted with their reports. Whenever practicable, 3 copies should be obtained. Fourthly, in relation to racial disturbances, the 1969 orders state at paragraph 76A that brief information of all disturbances or incidents where there is some racial significance is to be sent forthwith by teleprinter to A7 and confirmed by a report in triplicate with an additional copy for Special Branch. Paragraph 76A of the 1982 orders contain significantly developed provisions in relation to racial incidents. It provided that, 1, any incident, whether concerning crime or not, which is alleged by any person to include an element of racial motivation, or which appears to the reporting or investigating officer to include such an element, will be reported to the District Community Liaison Officer. 2, in addition to 1 above, any such incidents which may have serious impact upon community relations or arouse media interest will be reported immediately to A7, A8, Special Branch, Press Bureau, and the District Community Liaison Officer by teleprinter using the coded format RAC Inc., which is contained in the Metropolitan Police Directory. A full report will be submitted in confirmation. 3, serious racial disturbances will be reported in accordance with the instructions contained in para 95. Further UCO reporting and associated documents. We are reducing 54 further reports and other documents not previously published, which predominantly originate from Tranche 1 UCOs and are relevant to their deployments and or non-state core participants. A table of attribution, as far as it is known, has been provided to assist comprehension of these documents. Open transcripts and excerpts from the Tranche 1 closed hearings. Last autumn, we called 5 fully anonymous former SDS undercover police officers from the Tranche 1 era to give oral evidence at a closed hearing. The transcripts of those hearings have been put through the inquiry's restrictions order process and are being published today. There are 5 attributed transcripts together with some unattributed excerpts. The officers concerned are HN21, HN41, HN109, HN302, and HN341. Time does not permit me to introduce all of this material, but I will mention some of the salient features. HN21. HN21 infiltrated the Socialist Workers' Party at the end of the 1970s and start of the 1980s. Like most SDS undercover officers, he was a married man. He gave oral evidence that he had had sex on 2 occasions, 6 or 7 months apart, with a woman whom he had got to know quite well at an evening class he attended whilst undercover. He stated that the woman was apolitical and not an activist. He socialized with her as part of a small group. His evidence about the first time was that they had both been drinking and, I quote, "It was one evening whereby she was living in redact and she was quite frightened and I stayed overnight because one of the guys, redact, had been making approaches to her and she was a bit frightened. And I stayed there one evening till slightly later, and then it happened. We weren't too pleased about it because we were friends." HN21 described the second occasion on which he had sex with the same woman in the following terms, quote, "I accept there was one other occasion when she moved flat, redact. So it was one of the things that, because I had a car, you shift stuff around, and that happened at her new flat, and that was just a relaxing time, but it was some time afterwards." HN21 described getting amorous, by which he meant kissing and cuddling the woman on other occasions. HN21's oral evidence about sexual activity in his undercover identity was inconsistent with his witness statement, which refers to 2 women. HN21 raised the fact that he wished to change his evidence in this regard prior to the hearing, and at the hearing described the reference to the second woman in his witness statement as a mistake, which he did not spot before he signed the statement. HN21 described being a part of the small group of friends to which he and the woman he accepts that he had sex with belonged. and attending events with them was quite important to his cover. He stated that he had alluded to his backstory, but did not go into detail with her. He used contraception. He expressed regret about what he had done, but could not explain why he did it, saying initially, "I don't really know." He later said, quote, "It was a particular time and place, which was slightly surreal, and there were occasions when you were deployed that became surreal. It became unreal. You forgot about what your actual work was, and you started to relax, which is really dangerous. That's when things go terribly wrong. So I regret from a personal point of view, from my upbringing, and also from a professional point of view, but it was a weakness which I regret." And he said, "It was me not being professional and not following what I should have done." HN21 knew what he did was wrong and said that he did not tell anyone. HN21 also gave significant evidence of his experiences whilst infiltrating the SWP, including being involved in violent incidents and being directed to attend Blair Peach's funeral, which he did to identify people there. As to who was initiating violence on the streets, he stated, "It depended on exactly where it was and how many people were there. From the SWP side, it was mostly shouting. From the far right thing, it was mostly physical violence. You know, you knew if the police weren't there, then you would have to run for it." He described Maoist activists being violent towards the police, stating, "It was mostly scuffles, but against the police, it was full on, redact. Yes, they were a very strange bunch." HN21 has provided the inquiry with a name for the woman with whom he had sex during his deployment. We have attempted to identify and locate the woman in question using an inquiry agent. However, those inquiries did not produce details of any person who sufficiently fitted the information which the inquiry has about the woman in question from HN21 to justify an approach. HN41 was present at the demonstration at Southall at which Blair Peach died. He may have provided intelligence in advance about this event. His managers had some reservations about him attending, quote, because uniformed police were going to clamp down on the demonstrations. He provided a statement to police investigating Blair Peach's death, but he had no involvement with material events and did not recall coming across Mr. Peach during the day. HN 109. HN 109 is one of the few officers from the Tranche 1 era who recalls any written training material. However, he cannot recall there being any written instruction about sexual contact with people in his undercover identity. He does recall oral instructions to the effect that it was not permitted and understood that the SDS recruited married officers because, I quote, it had the potential to prevent involvement with others in sexual contact. He received glowing reports for his work, which was described as extremely important to Special Branch and the security service. He recalls congratulations from Downing Street being passed to the SDS for success in combating public disorder. HN 302. HN 302 gave evidence that whilst undercover and building up his cover, he met a woman at meetings and got to know her over a period of months. He could not remember her name. He said that he did not deliberately pick her out, but that a certain frisson developed between them. He socialized with her both with others and alone. He felt that their friendship bolstered his cover. He described her as a peripheral activist whom he did not see again after they had sex. He said that he had sex with the woman after an evening in the pub in circumstances where both had been drinking, but neither were drunk. He invited her back to his bedsit, where they had sex. He used contraception. She did not know that he was a police officer and he suspects that she would not have consented had she known. He thought having sex with her might have enhanced his cover, but it didn't. He answered no when asked whether it crossed his mind that he was a police officer on duty during this episode. He did not tell his supervisors or superiors because he didn't think that it was necessary. He thinks that if he had told them, he would have been given words of advice. He told no one else. On the question of subversion and the revolutionary potency of the groups that he infiltrated, HN 302 said, given the opportunity and the leadership and the right catalyst, the social circumstances perhaps at the time, I believe there was a possibility that that outcome might have taken place or been attempted. HN 341. HN 341 gave evidence of a relaxed and communal atmosphere in the safe house, but did not recall any conversation about women being targeted or women in the groups being targeted or UCOs sleeping with women. He felt that he had provided valuable public order intelligence during the course of his deployment, which was its primary purpose. His deployment was terminated after an incident which was stress-related. He found the work very stressful and smoked and drank a great deal to self-medicate. The unattributed excerpts. On the topic of using deceased children's identities, one officer gave evidence that he decided to adopt some particulars of a deceased child and did so after his managers accepted the proposal. Another officer recalls being told by the office that HN 297, Richard Clark's cover, had been blown when he was presented with the death certificate of the child whose particulars he had adopted. An officer gave evidence that during the course of his deployment, he attended a small wedding in his undercover identity, having been invited and secured the authority of his managers. He also babysat during the course of his deployment. He did both because they were good for his cover. The same officer also took cannabis during the course of his deployment. An officer witnessed violence on one of the occasions on which HN 13, who used a cover name Barry or Desmond Loader, was arrested and describes Maoists as being involved in the fighting. The officer himself was chased by supporters of the far right. In relation to the industrial dispute at the Grunwick factory, one officer describes attending about half a dozen times, witnessing some violence, and his managers being pleased with the intelligence which the undercover officers were providing. Another recalls being present and telephoning through intelligence consistent with that described in the SDS annual report for 1977. In relation to the Battle of Lewisham and the sort of advance intelligence provided by the SDS, one witness stated that the sort of intelligence provided was, quote, that it was going to kick off, that this was going to happen. If they marched that particular route at that particular time, coming up that road, then a lot of my comrades seemed to be aware of where they were going to come out or the only possible way they could go. And so the focus was on that particular area. On the topic of sexual relationships, one witness described HN 67, who used the cover name Alan Bond, being ribbed or subjected to banter by, possibly, Vince Harvey, suggestive that HN 67 might have fathered a child. Quote, I think one of the words was, I saw somebody pushing a pram and it looked just like you or something in that region. I thought that was a bit of banter, but I didn't think there was any basis in that particular comment. A witness described HN 300, who used a cover name Jim Pickford, as a sexual predator and an alcoholic, but was not aware that HN 300 had married someone he met in his undercover identity. The witness described HN 297 Richard Clark as a womanizer and carnivore. He also recounted that Clark had told him that, quote, he had been involved in fact, 2 sexual relationships, which led to his compromise. However, the witness was convinced that Richard Clark would not have told Geoffrey Craft about their sexual activity, quote, because Jeff Craft's attitude was sort of conservative and straight down the line. And I cannot believe for a second he wouldn't have been apoplectic about that, and we wouldn't have all been lectured at length about it. I am sure he and the office weren't aware, utterly convinced of it. The same witness went on to describe being shocked because the account of Richard Clark's compromise given in the safe flat by his managers was not the one that he was later given in the pub. Quote, I was shocked because I'd been told a story, and I can't remember whether it was on the same day. I am sure it probably was on the same day in the flat about him being presented with a birth certificate. And then I am getting a completely different story in the pub. And I just thought it was, leaving aside the morality of it, it was incredibly stupid to do that sort of thing whilst you were engaged in undercover work, because it was a quick road to disaster, as it turned out to be for him. He described the conversation in the pub as involving 4, 5, or 6 people in the pub. He did not report what Richard Clark had said to management. The same officer also gave evidence that HN 300 Jim Pickford had confessed falling in love with someone in his group, although not to actually entering into a relationship. The officer explained the position to the office, and that rapidly led to HN 300's withdrawal from his deployment in December 1976. The witness described the officer who used the cover name Jim Pickford as a man who couldn't hold himself, not a carnivore, but a man who, quote, genuinely fell in love with people all over the place. When asked who in the office he had spoken to, the officer stated that it was Angus McIntosh. He said managers did not speak to officers about what had happened to the officer who used the name Jim Pickford and the dangers of relationships. When told of the other undisputed sexual activity which the inquiry has received evidence of in Tranche 1, he said that he was shocked at the stupidity and the wrongness of it. A witness recalls Richard Clark saying that there was a lot going on in his group as far as, quote, horizontal politics was concerned, meaning sexual activity. Another witness recalls that, quote, Rick had a certain reputation, and it gradually came out that he had had a sexual relationship, which led to his being compromised. And that was, to my way of thinking, generally well known among the existing SDS officers. Tranche 1, Phase 3 witness statements. A number of broad observations can be made about the content of the witness statements that we have obtained for this phase of the inquiry's hearings. These observations are, of course, subject to the oral evidence which is to come. There are also many other issues that I and other members of the Counsel team will be exploring in oral evidence and those who are being called. All of the witnesses had prior experience within Special Branch before assuming either an administrative or managerial post within the SDS. There is no evidence of a formal application process for a role within the administration or management of the SDS. All state that there was no formal training provided specifically for a role within the management or administration of the SDS. Any training was informal and on the job. The SDS as a unit issued no formal guidance to its officers to set boundaries when it came to the extent to which undercover officers interfered with private lives, became involved in sexual activity in their undercover identity, or reported on legal professional privilege. There was no equality or diversity training. Although some of the early witnesses had attended meetings or demonstrations in plain clothes, whilst in the SDS, none of the witnesses worked undercover in an assumed identity. There are differing recollections about who made decisions on targeting and tasking. None of the witnesses states that he was aware of any sexual activity between contemporary SDS undercover officers and people whom they met undercover. However, there is some evidence of an awareness of the risk that this might occur. None of the witnesses give first-hand contemporaneous evidence of the SDS's decision to adopt the practice of using deceased children's identities as part of the process of building a cover identity. There is evidence that the SDS was not the first either to have the idea or to use this technique. Many witnesses give evidence to the effect that the technique improved the officer's cover and/or that they did not think that the families would ever find out. There is evidence relevant to the arrests and prosecutions of the officers who used the cover names Michael Scott and Desmond or Barry Loader, none of which suggests that the relevant courts knew that the men in front of them were undercover police officers. No Phase 3 witness states that he knew of violence being used by an SDS undercover police officer. The manager's evidence is that trade unions were not specifically targeted, and any reporting about trade unions arose because the SDS targets were involved with them. Next steps. The approach that we have taken in Tranche 1 has been to publish evidence relating to the management of the SDS, the dissemination of its reporting, and the involvement of relevant government bodies as we have proceeded. Thus, some Module 2B and Module 2C evidence has already been adduced. However, our work is ongoing in this area. We are moving away from our original plan, which was to deal with these issues in a separate tranche, Tranche 6. Instead, we are seeking to deal with them by incorporating them into the chronological approach that we are taking in Tranches 1 to 4. The approach that we are taking to evidence gathering in Module 2B, that is to say senior management and the dissemination of intelligence, was recently outlined with the draft Module 2B issues list that we have circulated for submissions. A draft Module 2C issues list will also be produced and circulated for submissions. The inquiry has been notified that sadly both HN80, who use the cover name Colin Clark, and HN106, who use the cover name Barry Tompkins, have passed away. I know that you, sir, will be considering whether to review the restriction orders which prohibit publication of their real names. We will need, amongst other things, to cover the legal framework. It is essential to the assessment of whether the SDS's activities were justified and to the fulfillment of other parts of the terms of reference. In that regard, we are grateful to Ms. Kilroy, Queen's Counsel, and her team for the helpful legal submissions that she is going to make at this hearing and which we have had advance sight of. We are considering them. We also anticipate that state court participants will wish to respond once they have had sufficient opportunity to do so. Once our Module 2B and 2C investigations are further advanced, decisions will be taken based on the evidence obtained as to whether oral hearings will be necessary in relation to the Tranche 1 era. I know, sir, that you wish to produce an interim report in order to enable those who had participated in Tranche 1 to have your findings without having to wait until the end of the inquiry. The scope of that report is a matter which I also know you will be considering once the further Tranche 1 era investigations that I have just mentioned are further advanced. The timescale will, of course, be dependent upon the scope of the interim report and the completion of the necessary investigations. Those who have participated in Tranche 1 including those representing the coordinating group of non-state core participants, will be afforded the opportunity to make closing submissions in due course. Turning to Tranche 2, we intend to start evidential hearings in the spring of 2024. Unlike Tranche 1, we are preparing to hear evidence of officers and relevant managers within the SDS without the long gaps between phases that have been necessary in Tranche 1. I'm afraid that it is not possible to provide a firm timetable for the remainder of the inquiry at this stage. Work is ongoing on Tranches 3 and 4, concurrently with our work on Tranches 1 and 2. Finally, I would like to thank all of those who have contributed to the preparations for this phase of the inquiry's work. As with previous phases, it has involved a great deal of effort on the part of a great many people, both within and outside the inquiry. We are grateful.
Thank you, Mr. Barr. We will now take an hour off for lunch and will therefore resume at 2:05 rather than 2 as planned. We will hear, I anticipate, from Mr. Skelton, Counsel for the Acting Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. Until